good evening, and welcome to the last Monday night Tysky, where you won't be able to go to a pub garden afterwards and get pissed. Yes, we have 7 days until a significant stage of the unlocking process. In 7 days' time, we will be able to drink in pub gardens, get haircuts, I think go to gyms. Ash, I can't remember every single one. What's the one that you're most excited about?
Eyebrow threading.
Interesting.
It's a niche one, but when it comes to, facial definition, I've always said that eyebrows are the boobs of the face. They're intended to draw the eye, create some much needed intrigue and definition. So yeah, I'm going to be turning up to next Monday's Tysky Sour with beautiful eyebrows and also absolutely legless.
Fabulous. Obviously, yes, Boris Johnson today gave a very high-profile press conference where he confirmed that we are on track for the unlocking, which he promised a couple of months ago, from next Monday. But the big headline was not that things are going to plan, even though they are, but that the government seems to have changed its tune when it comes to vaccine passports. We'll be discussing tonight whether this is a reasonable policy to reopen those places where social distancing will never be possible, such as nightclubs, football stadiums, or is this just one step to a dystopian big brother that pretends it's for public health? We are also going to be talking about the big announcement on lateral flow tests. I'm going to be speaking to an expert in the field, and we're going to discuss the latest in terms of the police crackdown on the movement against the policing and crime bill, and talk about a Labour right-winger, a Blairite, who I suppose chatted lots of bullshit on the radio on Sunday. As ever, do make sure you share the show link, tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Keep sending us your super chats and put your comments under the Twitch stream. Now, on the issue of vaccine passports, Boris Johnson has been on quite a journey. This was his stance on February 15th.
I think inevitably there will be great interest in ideas like, can you show that you've had a vaccination against COVID in the way that you sometimes you have to show that you've had a vaccination against yellow fever or other diseases in order to travel somewhere. I think that's going to be very much in the mix down the road. I think that is going to happen. What I don't think we will have in this country is, as it were, vaccination passports to allow you to go to, say, the pub or something like that.
That was February 15th. Let's fast forward to March the 25th. Here he suggested the need for vaccinations could, in fact, be left up to pub landlords.
I do think that the basic concept of vaccine certification should not be totally alien to us, because, after all, when you're entrusted with care of a patient, and you say you're a surgeon, you're expected to have a vaccination against hepatitis B. The principle is there. I think that's the kind of thing that it may be up to individual publicans. It may be up to the landlord.
So in February, he says, we won't have vaccine passports in pubs. By March, it's probably going to be up to the pub landlord. There was obviously a big announcement on it today. Let's see what Boris Johnson's latest line on vaccine passports is.
I think the most important thing to say to everybody listening and watching is that there is absolutely no question of people being asked to produce certification or COVID status report when they go to the shops or to the pub garden or to the hairdressers or whatever on Monday. So, and indeed, we're not planning that for step 3 either. May the 17th, as you know, we're hoping to go for the opening up of indoor hospitality and so on. We're not planning for anything of that kind at that stage. There are complicated ethical and practical issues, as I think I said last time, raised by the idea of COVID status certification, because for vaccination, using vaccination alone, just because after all, many people will be, for one reason or another, unable to get a vaccine for medical reasons, for instance, or perhaps because they're pregnant or whatever. So you've got to be very careful in how you handle this, and don't start a system that's discriminatory. But obviously, we're looking at it. We want to be going ahead in the next few weeks with some test events, some pilot events, which you can see in the roadmap that we've laid out, and big events like getting 20,000 people into Wembley on May the 15th, that kind of thing, getting people back into a theatre. That will unquestionably involve testing to allow the audience to participate in the numbers that people want.
So that was Boris Johnson today, very keen to suggest that vaccine passports won't be rolled out to the general population in the next 2 phases of the unlocking. So that's not until at least the 21st of June. That's when most venues, or all venues, I suppose, are supposed to open from that point in time. You also heard him there suggesting that some of the concerns that he originally had about vaccine passports are ameliorated because now people will be given an option to also have a test. So if you haven't yet had a vaccine, if you don't want a vaccine, if you haven't been offered, or you can't have one for medical reasons, then instead you could get a lateral flow test 24 hours or whatever the time limit is before the event. Or if you can prove you had COVID in the previous 6 months, that will mean that you also are entitled to an immunity certificate, or whatever they end up calling it. The concrete announcement is that this certification scheme will be trialled at some large spectator events in the coming months, and that includes the FA Cup semi-final and final. I doubt actually this full system is going to be in place for the semi-finals, because that's in 2 weeks' time, but the final is the 15th of May, and they seem very confident that they want to have that as an event where, to get in, you have to show your vaccine passport. Ash, what do you make of the vaccine passport plan?
Okay, so before I get into the criticisms, I can, of course, see the upsides of it, right? There are upsides in terms of being able to safely facilitate the gathering of people, minimize the need, perhaps, for social distancing as well. So you can have a bit more ambience, you can have a bit more of that sense of being in a crowd and really relaxing and not, constantly monitoring your distance between people. Those are all lovely things. But I'm instinctively uncomfortable. And I'm instinctively uncomfortable when this government in particular wants to expand its powers of surveillance and exclusion, even if it's for relatively trivial or non-essential social gatherings like a football match or a nightclub and what have you. The idea that that's going to be where, the government is sticking its beak in more than it already does, I think puts me off in a very big way. This government has not used powers responsibly. 2, when you think about what kind of infrastructure will be needed to set it up and make it work, well, we had a test and trace system, which was essentially a slush fund for corporate buddies of government ministers. So it was an opportunity for huge transfers of public money into private hands. We also didn't end up with a system that even worked. So there are specific problems in terms of how will this government go about doing it. And then I think there's a third thing, which is about fairness and inclusion. So there aren't any plans, as you said, to have vaccine passports to get into pharmacies or doctors' offices or supermarkets. Basic essentials will still sort of be protected. But why shouldn't an undocumented migrant or someone with precarious status be able to go to the pub or a football match or something like that? It's not just about immigration status. It's also things like learning difficulties and old age. And, there are community centers which take the form of cafes and pubs and kind of hospitality venues, which often are real lifelines to people who are really vulnerable in lots of ways. And they're exactly the kinds of people who tend to get squeezed out when you introduce new forms of, identity barriers before you can access a kind of social space. I remember when I was working in a pub, like some of our, most frequent and beloved regulars were exactly that kind of person. Someone who was kind of already on the margins, didn't have a huge social network or support system that they could rely on, weren't particularly well off, and being able to come to the pub every day was their contacts with other people. And so introducing a barrier to that, which is always going to disproportionately impact those kinds of people with precarious immigration status, people with learning difficulties and other kinds of disabilities, people who don't have much money, real capital, or indeed the kind of social capital you need to navigate these systems. Those are all things that make me uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly the big issue which we'd need a lot of reassurance about is how long is this going to last? Because quite plausibly it could just be a 6-month system which ends afterwards. And also, where do they draw the line about where it will be used? Because you can imagine, if it's impossible to open the FA Cup final without it, then having an FA Cup final which isn't as inclusive as it normally would be, I mean, I don't think they're normally particularly inclusive events anyway, probably worth it. If it then, once you've introduced it for that, you end up introducing it for all pubs, I can see your argument about how that becomes exclusionary in quite an important way. Let's look at the justification from the government themselves. We got confirmation that these trials were taking place when Michael Gove wrote in the Sunday Telegraph this weekend. So these were his justifications for the move. So Gove writes, "If we do accept that COVID certification is going to be required to travel abroad, the question then follows, can these certificates help in other ways? If Israel can accelerate its citizens' returns to nightclubs, football stadia and theatres with these certificates, might we? Given the hit the nighttime economy and the entertainment sector has taken over the last year, anything which might help businesses reopen sooner must be worth considering. That is why the government proposes to pilot the use of certification criteria in a range of venues this month. Events which would have been closed to the public until much later this year will now be able to admit spectators who've been vaccinated or tested." Now, later in the article, Michael Gove does say he opposes it being used for supermarkets, chemists and GP surgeries. He doesn't make any mention of those more grey areas such as pubs, although Boris Johnson has sort of suggested in the meantime that they won't be introduced into pubs anytime soon, but you can quite clearly have function creep. So you introduce them for things like football stadiums, and then you end up having pub landlords saying, actually, we want them as well. And then you have some of the same exclusionary outcomes that Ash was talking about earlier. The other issue is how this would work. So what new technologies will be set up? Will this imply a level of surveillance that we haven't already been used to? Now, for this, we can start to look to other countries where they are slightly ahead of us on this question. We're not alone in having a conversation about vaccine passports. So this is a graphic from the Telegraph again. So Israel has already set up quite a developed pass system. So they give inoculated citizens a green pass so they can use gyms and hotels. China has built a vaccine passport system into WeChat, which is its most popular social network. Denmark has developed a Corona Pass system granting access to hairdressers, restaurants and cinemas for immunized citizens. France is considering a health pass allowing vaccinated people to resume leisure activities. And Bahrain has introduced the Be Aware app that can be used to prove that subjects have received 2 doses of a jab. Now, I've looked into the Israel system. That's all linked up to an existing mandatory ID card system. So obviously, that means that they haven't had to set up a technology that would worry us in this country because we don't have mandatory ID cards. Most people don't want mandatory ID cards. In Israel, it was very easy to roll out this system because you linked someone's identity, which is already obvious on this card, centrally controlled, and then you match it to the vaccination status. The little video I was watching, there were older people super happy that they could go to the gym, just showing their card. People obviously have civil liberties concerns, but for most people, they're just like, this is super, super convenient. That's not to say that should be an overwhelming argument. Denmark, they haven't quite rolled theirs out yet, but they do seem fairly advanced in it. And I think it looks actually quite likely that their technology will be rolled out across much of Europe. It's called the Corona Pass app, and we can take a look here at what it's gonna look like. You'll have on your phone a picture of yourself. It tells your vaccination status, or again whether you've had a test in the last 24 hours, and then you've got a barcode that whoever's, I suppose, running the door or checking tickets at your venue can scan to make sure that it's not a fake. Obviously, that implies that there will be everyone's identity and their vaccination status stored on some kind of central database. Obviously, there'll be disputes about who can and who cannot access that database. That will determine how secure and private the system is. On the politics of it, I thought this was quite interesting. In Denmark, this is from The Local, which is quite a good website for looking at especially the politics of Northern Europe. So they write, the plan was announced after an agreement was reached between the minority government and a broad section of parliament. The agreement includes a sundown clause on the corona passports. That means they can no longer be required apart from in relation to travel and tourism when everyone in Denmark has been offered a vaccine, which is likely to be by August this year, according to the current vaccination calendar. So, I mean, many people, I mean, I would be inclined to find the sunset clause fairly reassuring. Is it reassuring enough? Will the government think if we introduce it here, we have this technology now, let's find an excuse not to get rid of it already. We've invested the money. Let's keep it and repurpose it for some longer term surveillance system to check out your health. I'm still kind of unclear what the motive is there for them to sort of carry it on beyond the pandemic. I don't know. Ash, what do you think about this? Because a big issue here, and it's very speculative. People are saying, look, I wouldn't mind if this was only in place until the pandemic was over, but I don't trust them to get rid of it once we're through this, once they're actually not needed anymore.
Well, boy, oh boy, do I have a hot take for you on this one, because there are so many examples where you have these technologies of governance or monitoring, which are supposed to be for some kind of exceptional circumstance. Usually it's not something like a public health emergency, but because it's monitoring a section of the population who've been deemed exceptional in some way because they're criminals or they're undocumented migrants or, they're suspected of being, benefits cheats. And then you do see mission creep in terms of these ways of monitoring. So, for instance, you had various forms of monitoring which were only supposed to be for convicted criminals. And then you saw a form of mission creep as they became applied to people with first ASBOs and then PSPOs. So you don't have to be, convicted of a criminal offense as such to be subject to these various forms of control and monitoring. Similarly, ways of monitoring and surveilling those who were suspected of being undocumented migrants, that then had mission creep onto, say, welfare recipients. So it's not just the Conservative government. Many of these things that I'm talking about had their origins in the glory days of Tony Blair. But you do have a tendency where governments set up exceptional forms of monitoring, exceptional technologies of governance, and then you find them being applied elsewhere. And we have seen, I think, lots of kinds of norms being eroded over the last year. And not all of them are to do simply with civil liberties. Some of them are also about monitoring and democratic accountability. So, for instance, the lack of oversight that we've seen when it's come to, doling out contracts for public money, I don't think that accountability is magically going to come back once the pandemic is over. When you think about some of the, quite extraordinary and politicized uses of police power that we've seen in clamping down on protests in recent months, I don't think that that's something that's going to go away, particularly when you've got a Home Secretary like Priti Patel at the helm who wants to politicize the role of the police. And so while it might not be that this exact database then just rolls over into a new use or this exact technology just, gets reapplied again, I think that there are legitimate fears, non-cranky fears, that aspects of it will be sort of taken, rehashed and repackaged. Where they might be applied, it's hard to tell, but these things often are. I don't think very many people thought that, the kind of technologies of monitoring for undocumented migrants would suddenly be applied to in similar systems for welfare recipients. But there we go. That's what happened.
I mean, at the same time, that argument was made about loads of policies which ended up being essential. So the lockdown, for example, there were lots of lockdown skeptics who say, once the government have put us into lockdown, we're going to be stuck in lockdown forever. And it was like, well, what's the incentive for them to keep us in lockdown forever? Well, I mean, look, and obviously for public health reasons, we had to do it anyway. It's weighing up the pros and the cons, but sorry.
It's weighing up the pros and the cons. And also some stuff is stupid and some stuff isn't. I mean, what would a government purpose be in having a lockdown which never ended? So you had the collapse of the economic system as we know it, which keeps, many members of the cabinet rich. Well, there's not really an obvious reason why the government would want to oversee that. Whereas you can see reasons why this could be a useful technology in different contexts. And that's the thing that you've got to assess. So I'm not saying that, based on the issue of vaccine passports alone, it means you've got to do coalition building with Lawrence Fox. But I do think that you've got to take these issues of civil liberties seriously, not be complacent about them. And also don't leave it up to the kind of libertarian cranky right to make the case for freedom as its own good, not necessarily a kind of contingent benefit, which, you could lose if it means that you get to have an FA Cup final.
Yeah. Right, let's go to some comments. Megan Forrest tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Ash Sarkar echoing my thoughts exactly on vaccine passports, although much more eloquently than I could. And Raji Adi with a $4.99 super chat was just thinking what a good idea vaccine passports are. Ash has changed my mind. So lots of love coming in for you there, Ash. Keep sending us your comments. You can tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Let's move on to whether this will happen, because it's not clear to me. And it also actually raises some interesting political questions. Now, according to The Telegraph, Michael Gove has promised Tory MPs there will be a vote on any proposal for vaccine passports. So they won't just introduce it via executive powers. Boris Johnson was actually reluctant to confirm that today in the press conference. But let's, for the purposes of argument, assume that Michael Gove wasn't lying. Would they manage to get that through the Commons? It's not clear because there is also a fairly broad coalition in opposition. That includes 70 MPs who've already written an open letter opposing the use of vaccine passports. Within that 70 MPs is 41 Conservatives and 2 past leaders of both major parties, so Jeremy Corbyn and Ian Duncan Smith. To actually defeat the government, you'd need all opposition parties to vote against the bill plus 60 Tory rebels. This, of course, means that Starmer will play a key role. If he whips his MPs against vaccine passports, then there's a significant possibility that the Libertarian Tory backbenchers will mean that Boris Johnson is defeated. And we've had some indication that Keir Starmer was considering voting against vaccine passports. He did an interview with The Telegraph recently, and this was just last week, in fact, which was headlined, Keir Starmer thinks that vaccine passports would be un-British. So he was pitching himself there against this potential policy proposal. Why I think it's probably unlikely that Keir Starmer will whip against this is because it turns out that whilst he said it was un-British, the British public kind of disagree. So there is quite widespread support across age groups for vaccine passports once the rollout is complete. Now, I'm going to read actually you the whole question here, because whether or not people support vaccine passports depends quite a lot on the details which are within the question. So YouGov asked, some people have suggested introducing a system of vaccine passports. This system would involve giving everyone a vaccine passport once they have received their COVID-19 vaccines and allowing services and venues to reopen so long as they only serve those who have already been vaccinated, i.e. those who can show their vaccine passport. In principle, would you support or oppose introducing such a system? Now, phrased like that, when you look at the youngest demographic, only 45% would support that being rolled out while the vaccine rollout is still ongoing. But that goes up to 60% once everyone has been offered a vaccine. Then once you get to the over 65s, 75% want a vaccine passport now, basically, and 85% would want one when the rollout is complete. The reason the specific question there is relevant, because it could be the case that if you specified to 18 to 24-year-olds that you wouldn't just get this vaccine passport if you'd had a vaccine, but you could also get a lateral flow test, then maybe that would increase the support for it. It's difficult to know. Another very interesting part of this poll was where people would support introducing a vaccine passport. So 72% of the public think that you should need a vaccine passport to get into a care home. 56% think you should need one to get into a gym. There's 10% who don't know there. 56% for pubs, 55% for cinemas, 53% for restaurants. So there's a plurality in terms of most of these places where people think you should need a vaccine passport. Although once you get to coffee shops, hospitals, shopping centres, that's when people say, no, you should not need a vaccine passport. So not actually that different from the government position at this point in time. There is one thing that the public do agree on, which is probably not what the government are planning, though. Britons tend to be opposed to private companies being allowed to develop their own vaccine passport systems. So there's a big majority of people who say if we're going to have a vaccine passport system, it should be done by the state. Now, the reason I think, even though there is some opposition to this, it's going to be very difficult for Keir Starmer to stand up and oppose it, is because one, it seems fairly popular. The downsides to it are all fairly abstract. And if Keir Starmer stands up and says, I'm going to vote this down with your libertarian backbenchers, Boris Johnson can basically stand up at PMQs and said, look, Keir Starmer, you backed lockdown with me. We recognized that when a pandemic comes, you have to limit civil liberties. We all know how difficult that was. You backed that. Now we have a possibility, which is relatively cost-free for people, that we can reopen the FA Cup final. And for some very abstract concerns that I don't seem to understand, you want to deny people that opportunity. And Keir Starmer will say, well, I don't trust that you won't continue having these vaccine passports beyond the pandemic. And Boris Johnson will say, well, look, I've already ruled that out. Why are you so committed to stopping people going to the FA Cup final? Ash, I want your predictions now. What are your predictions on whether this will go through? Do you agree with me that Keir Starmer's probably going to say, look, I don't want to be the guy that stands between the British public and going to nightclubs, concerts, FA Cup finals, when the downsides are these sort of speculative things that may or may not happen in the future?
I mean, look, we know that Keir Starmer generally is led by the nose when it comes to focus groups and polling. And in terms of the voters that he's looking to win over, vaccine passports are unequivocally popular with that group. So I think that he sort of pinned his colours to the mast, quite early on when he was suggesting that they're un-British. It remains to be seen whether that will result in actually voting down or abstaining so he can preserve his blushes. But I think you're right. I think the politics of it make it tricky for him to take a principled stance based on civil liberties. I think that he might have sort of he might have sort of underestimated the public appetite for increasingly authoritarian measures when it comes to managing the virus.
Or wanting to go to football matches and nightclubs, right? I don't think this is just a pathological desire for authoritarian measures.
No, I think you've got to look at it within a context of wider measures which have also enjoyed broad public support. So when you're looking at things like, the £10,000 fines and, there are all sorts of silly news stories around, jail terms for people that don't obey, lockdown or don't self-isolate when they know they've got the virus. People are like, yeah, that sounds great. So I think that, of course, people want to do the positive stuff, right? And there's a kind of broad mood of like, we would really, really like this to be over. We would really like to, socialize and go to the football and do all sorts of fun stuff. But there is also, I think, a sense of, I want everyone to be abiding by the strictest possible rules, even if I myself don't really want to abide by them. And I do think that's something that you see a lot in terms of polling about, which particular measure would the public support. And it's something that you've got to bear in mind, is that the British public really like authoritarian measures as long as other people have to abide by them. And you, the individual, the protagonist of reality, doesn't really have to.
Now, the other big announcement from today's press briefing was on lateral flow tests. So from this Friday, 2 tests per week will be offered to everyone, regardless of age or occupation. They will be available by post to pick up from pharmacies or from workplaces and local authority centres. Now, at today's press briefing, Boris Johnson and Patrick Vallance, he's the chief scientific advisor, explained the reasoning for the ramping up of lateral flow tests.
I think that lateral flow testing will be of great advantage to us all as we go forward. I mean, I do lateral flow tests before I go out on a visit to test whether or not I might conceivably be infectious. I think it's a sensible thing to do. The NHS is now offering, as I say, these free tests, and I think people should use them. No.
Lateral flow tests are effective at picking up people who are infectious. They're not 100% effective. So a negative doesn't mean you absolutely haven't got it, but a positive is useful to identify those people who then need to isolate. And you're right that testing alone isn't what matters. It matters if you're positive, and it's a true positive, you isolate. And lateral flow tests are definitely part of a way of trying to pick up more people who otherwise wouldn't be picked up.
So as usual, there you heard Boris Johnson sounding very, very enthusiastic, and you heard Patrick Vallance being a bit more reserved. You know, they're not completely reliable, but they're one part of a much broader agenda, which will probably, on balance, do a good thing. Will it, on balance, do a good thing? Though I'm joined to discuss that question by John Deeks, Professor of Biostatistics at Birmingham University. John leads their test evaluation research group. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. What do you make of this plan?
Good evening. Well, it's something which we were promised back last September with the moonshot proposals that we'd all be getting these lateral flow tests. At that time, when you listened to the scientist, to John Bell, he was talking about these tests picking up 9 out of 10 people. And the reality is that the test we've got, the Innova test, is nowhere near that good. So we have to look at the data quite carefully to understand how well these tests work. Because what we've learned in the last few months is that they're not really very good at picking up people who are asymptomatic, the people without symptoms. They work pretty well in people who have symptoms. And all of the original data the government was telling us about was from studies where people had symptoms. So the only data we have actually for how well these tests work in people without symptoms is from Liverpool, from the mass pilot. And there the data showed that actually they found 70 people in their study who had COVID, and the test found 28 of them. So it was pretty poor. And there's a lot of discussion, as Patrick Vallance mentioned, about these are good at picking up people who are infectious. Well, that's actually a pretty hard thing to nail down. We can't really tell whether somebody's infectious or not. What they're actually talking about, are they good at picking up the people with high viral loads? Now, a bad test picks up the easy cases, and they're the ones who have high viral loads. And in Liverpool, we found that it managed to get 2/3 of those in the highest group of high viral loads. So it missed a third still. So we're looking at these tests thinking, oh dear, they're not going to pick up everybody. They'll pick up some. And that's a good thing, providing they don't actually mislead people in the way of picking up just those few which they actually succeed with. And that's a concern we've been discussing.
Is there a way you think to sort of roll them out? Because I suppose the argument for them is, you say, look, if people are doing activities that they do anyway, then finding some people who are positive is better than finding no people who are positive. So if people are already going to go to the football match, then if you find 2/3 of the people who have COVID, that's better than finding none of them. On average, you will help reduce the R. Do you think there is a way they could roll this out where we only got really the plus sides of this? Or do you think it's inevitable that this is going to give people a false sense of security and end up potentially actually increasing the spread of the virus?
That's the worry, is that actually when you get a negative test, we're left thinking, oh, I've got a negative test. I'm safe. I'm free. I haven't got the virus. Boris Johnson just said it on that clip you showed us, that he's not infectious. That's why he does the test. And that's using them as a green light test. And that's what we're not meant to do. We're meant to use them as red light tests, which say, stop, go back home, isolate, order yourself a PCR test. So the problem is that because they miss half the cases roughly, it means that when you get a negative test, your chances of having the infection are half of what it was before you had the test done. And that's not enough to be safe. It's not enough to say, okay, I can go and hug my granny. It's not enough to say I can go to a football match and stand 2 feet from the person next to me or even closer. All of those things we're going to make mistakes with by doing this. Now, there are tests which are better than the one we've got. I think one of the issues we've got is actually the evidence for the Innova test has all come out of Department of Health studies. There is no independent evaluation of this test from any other country. And people at the World Health Organization have been doing a whole set of great studies through an organization called the Foundation for Innovative Diagnostics of the other lateral flow tests. And some of them are looking really bad and some of them are looking really good. So if we're a little bit wiser and chose a better test, we'd actually move forwards a bit quicker. And in time, these tests will get really good. I'm pretty confident that in the future we'll be using these tests, but the ones we've got now are the first ones off the block, and we're being a little bit misled as to how good they are by what the government keeps telling us.
I want to bring up a tweet from Susan Mickey today. So she's on the SAGE subcommittee advising SAGE on behavioural science. She's been on the show before. She tweeted, until we get adequate financial and practical support for people to isolate when symptomatic or testing positive, there is little point ramping up testing. just because government has brought millions of lateral flow tests doesn't mean they need to be used if ineffective. Now, we've talked a lot on this show about how, if you're going to roll out testing, you also want to roll out support for people to self-isolate. It's value for money, and it's a sort of obvious no-brainer. They probably don't want to do it, or it seems they don't want to do it for ideological reasons. What I want to focus on with you, though, John, is this question. Do you think they are just rolling these out because they've bought them? It has seemed for a while that this was the pet project of Dominic Cummings, who wanted to roll out this moonshot campaign. They struck this deal with Innova, or Innova, or however you pronounce it. And ever since then, they've just been desperate to find a use for all of these kits.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a scientist, so I'm struggling to actually understand the psychology of how government ministers make decisions at this point, I'm afraid. I mean, there are other uses they could put these to. I mean, they followed a scientific program to come up with some studies which give them a grounding for doing this, but they're all usually based on mathematical models, which have, they start with a load of assumptions, and the answer you get depends on what assumptions you put in at the beginning. And there's so little data, as I've already told you, as to how well these tests work. We're just making assumptions. But there is another model which they could use these tests for, which would be really good, and that's actually to use them in test and trace centres, because these tests work better in people who've got symptoms. And one of our biggest faults with test and trace is it takes you days to get the results. So if you went to a test and trace centre, you had one of these tests done, you get the results whilst you wait there. And if you had the infection control team there, and you had the forms to fill in for financial support there, and advisors to help you, you could start contact tracing within 30 minutes, which is 3 days earlier than we do now. And that really is going to be the way in which we actually control this virus. We'll be able to go to football matches when we've got vaccination, sure, but when there's actually not such great leakage of virus going on. We're spending all this money trying to find the needles in the haystack with this let's test everybody twice a week, when we've got this test and trace program, which everybody knows is not working, and there hasn't been a single new idea put forward as to how to improve it since last year. So, I mean, that's really, I think, where, we need to be knocking heads together and saying, let's do something new. These tests give results pretty quick. We'd still back them up with a PCR. That's easy to do. And we could actually move forward and get the contact tracing and get the support working at a local level. It's not the model we've paid for with our consultancy companies running this, which may be the problem, but it's one which we should look at switching to.
And finally, having looked a lot at these tests, how worried should we be about false positives? I think that the government have said it's 1 in 1,000, but if we're testing, obviously, 25 million people a week, that becomes 25,000 false positives a week. Are we going to start seeing a huge surge in positive cases, which are actually just because we're testing too many people?
Well, yeah, I mean, whether it's 1 in 1,000 or even less than that is, that's what's being debated. They're actually really good at not giving false positives, but you still get them. And as you say, the more people you test, the more you'll see. And I think we've had this issue in the last few weeks of the introduction of testing in secondary schools, where the people who were tested positive weren't being backed up by having a PCR. And so, you couldn't tell the difference between a false positive and a true positive. So there are whole clusters of families and bubbles, and, it was creating mayhem for many schools as soon as they went back. And so the false positive problem becomes more of an issue when the disease becomes really rare, because it means when you get a positive result, you get to a point where it's more likely to be wrong than right. We all have to put up with a bit of it. We're never going to eradicate it completely. So, in the times we're at right now, where the disease rates actually are quite low, it's probably a bit more of an issue for the person who gets the result. The government always takes the strategy of saying they're very rare, it doesn't matter. But actually, when you've got a positive result, you're the person who needs to know, if I lock myself down and I take my family out of school and everything else and create all this mayhem for my contacts, is that all a lie? And that really is important. And it's very easy to sort out with taking a PCR test afterwards. So they are there. The test actually, is very good at not giving them very often. And we have a strategy for sorting them out. And the government had stopped doing that strategy back at the end of January. Last week, they announced they were going to start it again, which is a battle which, we were campaigning for in the Royal Statistical Society and other places for weeks. It was too late for some of the people who started school, but at least it's fixed now.
Well done for getting that win. John Deeks, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
No worries. Pleasure. Thank you.
You're watching Novara Media, Tysky Sour, of course. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. If you are enjoying what you're watching, then please consider becoming a supporter. To do that, go to novaramedia.com/support. Donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do that, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. Now, since the first vigil in memory of Sarah Everard, the police have come under widespread criticism for their heavy-handed treatment of protesters, in particular women. This weekend, we learned of 2 more really quite shocking incidents, which should shame the force. 2 incidents which took place in Bristol. Both were police tracking down participants from a protest 2 weeks ago. So that protest that ended up with a fair amount of violence on the street, although as you'll find out, the 2 people here were not involved. So the first incident involved 21-year-old Kate McGoran. She had left the protest before violence broke out, but last week was handcuffed in her bedroom after police had tricked their way into her shared student house pretending to be postmen. So she told The Observer, "It was frightening having all these policemen in my room after what happened to Sarah Everard and seeing footage of the vigil in Clapham. I was only wearing a t-shirt, underwear and a short dressing gown. I felt really vulnerable. I started having a panic attack. I was so scared. I was shrieking and asking to call my mum, but they said no and told my flatmate to go to her room." Now, she told The Observer that the officers kept her in handcuffs even after they realized she didn't match the picture of the person they were looking for, and then watched her as she struggled to put her joggers on. So again, more comments from the person in question. "I couldn't put them on because of the cuffs. I was crying. It was really humiliating. They were making jokes when they had caused me to have a panic attack." Really, really awful to hear. Now, the second incident involved a 16-year-old. The family of Grace Hart, who is 16, claims she answered the door twice to a male officer pretending to be a postal worker with a package for her flatmate. Her father, Paul Hart, said she became suspicious, so she started to close the door. The officer, he claimed, then barged in along with a group of at least 3 other plainclothes male officers shouting "police" and pointing tasers at her. They pushed her up against the wall. They had tasers out. She had red dots on her body, he said. 3 of those could have killed her because of the voltage. It's an excessive use of force. It's absolutely horrendous. The officers, claimed Hart, searched the entire house, including his daughter's room, even though the person they were looking for wasn't there and Grace didn't attend any of the protests. Grace said she felt violated by the raid and added, "I'm now really nervous to open the door when I don't know who is behind it." 2 just incidents that just sound, appallingly disturbing. And again, just incidents where, the police have massively overstepped the mark. They're using quite significant anti-terror tactics, as if, when they barge into the house, they're expecting someone's going to attack them or shoot them when they're knocking on the door of a student flat. Everyone who lived in that house was a woman who'd attended, a protest where some things got thrown. It wasn't any of them, but they weren't serious criminals. Ash, I want to bring you in on this particular story. I mean, what did you make of those accounts?
I mean, what this screams of is a gang who feel that their turf have been infringed on. And so what they want to do is reassert their authority in the most spectacular and brutal and heavy-handed ways possible. That's what it looks like. Quite obviously, these police are not using their powers in a proportionate way. You're using these counter-terror tactics for a student house, even if you did suspect that, these 2 young women were responsible for, I don't know, throwing an egg or shoving or jostling. Pointing tasers is not a proportionate response, which is commensurate with the risk you seriously think they pose. It also transpires that the intelligence that they were operating on was either non-existent or, lacked credibility. And 3, you've also got this horrible gendered element where there seems to be a real perverse pleasure being taken in intimidating women. And in the case of the first story that you talked about, of a woman being in her bedroom, handcuffed in her underwear and a t-shirt and a short robe, there's a feeling of gendered vulnerability there. And it's horrible. It's horrible. Absolutely no police officer should be okay with seeing somebody who clearly doesn't pose a risk in that amount of distress and, being that vulnerable. And it's completely outrageous that she was kept in handcuffs even after they'd worked out that she didn't match the description of the photo. But it's unsurprising. It's the kind of horrible, heavy-handed tactic which you do see on a much more regular basis outside of the context of public order policing. Focused on, disproportionately working class communities and working class communities of colour. I'll never forget being at Notting Hill Carnival and seeing a teenager, this kid who's quite obviously a teenager, being stopped and searched with his hands cuffed behind his back, shoved up against a wall. And the entire search, which was being carried out on suspicion of possession of drugs, was carried out with this teenager in handcuffs. That's not to mitigate the actual risk. It's about stamping down the authority. And I think that, again, this is something which is not an emergency response to an exceptional situation. It's something which, in this case, the Avon and Somerset Police Force, I feel able to act upon because they've got the political cover to do so. For as long as we've got this government and an opposition which, quite frankly, is not taking civil liberties all that seriously, then I think that you will see more police forces abuse their power in this way.
So that was Avon and Somerset Police. We're not going to leave out the Metropolitan Police. So they've also, made a bit of a show of themselves this weekend. So there were fairly big protests in London this weekend. They were against the policing bill and the pitiful statistics when it comes to prosecutions for violence against women. So like much of these protests, a sort of combination of two concerns, which is gender-based violence and a crackdown on protest. Now, we can look at some scenes of this. There's a decent-sized crowd you can see here. That was in Parliament Square. In terms of the behaviour of the police and how they interacted with the crowd, we can have a look now at scenes of police charging a crowd of people and grabbing people. It looks to me like they're clearly trying to clear the street, or at least clear the entrance to that building, but they're doing it by basically just running into a crowd of people, grabbing people and throwing them across. Doesn't seem like the most sensitive way to police any kind of protest. I also can't go without showing you what has now become the traditional way that all protests end in London. It's now something the police will never not do at a central London protest. We can see them guarding the statue of Winston Churchill there. So as far as I understand, there was no intelligence to suggest that someone was going to pull down the Winston Churchill statue or cause serious harm to it. I think they just like the photo opportunity because it gets certain people annoyed. The big news from that demonstration in London was the police arrested 107 people, including 2 legal observers. Now, that's controversial, as legal observers aren't there to take part in the protest, but just to record what's going on. It's not a legal status. You don't, it's not in law that police aren't supposed to arrest legal observers because it's not an official position. It's basically a self-prescribed position, but it's still, it's not the done thing. There's no reason why they should do that. It's also, a bit much, given Cressida Dick justified Kate Middleton going to the Sarah Everard vigil despite COVID regulations because Cressida Dick said she was working. Now, Kate Middleton working is just, she happens to be a princess. Legal observers, that's actual work. You've gone to a protest, you've got your notebook, you're taking notes about how the protesters and the police are interacting. You are actually doing a job there. You're doing something socially useful, but they are the people who get arrested. Ash, I want your comments, I suppose, on these arrests, on the policing of the protest, but also, how much legs do you think this movement has got? That was quite a lot of people in Parliament Square. They were seeing protests every weekend, and it doesn't seem like they're going to dissipate anytime soon.
Well, I think the real test for this movement is to what extent can they build outwards. And there are successes in it. You see these protests, which were initially concentrated mostly around Bristol, spreading to London, saw protests taking part in Leeds and Manchester as well. I think it's because it does speak to a very intense suspicion people feel, particularly young people who identify as progressive, of this government with regards to civil liberties. And who can blame them? You've got a Home Secretary who has said, I don't like protests, or I don't believe in protests, when on LBC with Nick Ferrari. And you've got police forces, when given the latitude to do so, have behaved in politicized and disproportionate and violent ways in order to stamp their authority against those who are deemed to be unruly. So I think for as long as you've got that caliber of political opponent, both within the police force itself and within the government, then yeah, you will see this movement build. What victory would look like, what it would mean to achieve a win, I think is the tricky bit. So how are you going to work that out? Because this bill obviously contains so many measures, not just in terms of, the criminalization of peaceful protest, but also its impact on the GRT community, which I understand you talked about in some detail last week on Tysky, that even if it passed with some amendments to protect civil liberties, it would still be a bad and an unjust and in places a discriminatory bill. So working out what victory would look like, what would the transitional demands be, or do you not let up until you achieve the whole thing? And what are the mechanisms for achieving the whole thing? Do you work with libertarian Tories? Do you try and get the Labour Party on board? Or do you simply become, a word which a lot of anarchos like to use is ungovernable? All of these things have benefits and drawbacks. The benefits of electoral coalition building is that you don't have to try and out-muscle the institutions of state. The drawbacks are that what's likely is that you get some amendments in, but the core of the bill, particularly its impact on marginalized communities, that remains the same. Or you try and do the thing of, okay, we'll have a mass campaign of non-compliance, ranging from non-violent acts of civil disobedience all the way through to confrontations with the police. Well, certainly that's becoming ungovernable, and what that can do is demonstrate that this bill is unenforceable. But of course, that comes with drawbacks as well. When you have a strategy of confrontation with the police in that way, what can often lead to is a kind of insular and inward-looking movement culture, something which isn't so interested in coalition building. And you've got the really obvious drawbacks of people being sucked into the criminal justice system, which is itself off-putting and also a really distressing thing to go through. So yeah, you've got all sorts of drawbacks, all sorts of, I think, strategic concerns which need to be taken into account. And I'm interested to see where it goes. I think that sometimes there's a tendency on parts of the left to view these discussions as being optics. It's like, oh, this is all just optics. No, it's called discipline, strategy, and a theory of change. And you've really got to engage seriously with all of these things.
Ash, I've got a important question for you before we go on to our last story. So prepare yourself. It's from Joshua Youngerman with $5. And he asks, will Ash be getting a vaccine passport just to see Arsenal beat Tottenham again next year?
Get fucked. Why? No. I want to take this up with you, Michael, because you're the host of Tysky Sour, so the buck stops with you. Okay. Do we not have an anti-bullying mods policy when it comes to the comments? Because this is deeply hurtful to me and very insensitive. Considering the recent trauma of Spurs' performance. And so now you
chooses the questions, I just read them out.
And you dump this on my plate. I feel the audacity, the gall, the cheek, and the gumption.
Would you get a vaccine passport if you knew that Tottenham were going to win?
Yeah, a vaccine passport and a new manager, yeah.
All right, final story. Keir Starmer has been Labour leader for 12 months now. Many have been assessing his first year in charge. We did so on Friday's show, and it was happening all weekend. Now, on that topic, this is former Labour Home Secretary and Blairite Alan Johnson speaking to Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
I think you have to be in the Labour Party to really appreciate where we were in December 2019 compared to where we are now. I mean, I thought we were finished. You know, when you see us losing Redcar, Bishop Auckland, Sedgefield, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Bolsover, yeah, it really looked as if it might all be over for us. Not because of that election result, but because this cult of the far left had virtually taken over the party at all levels. And it looked as if the only successor to Corbyn would be a Corbynista, and then we'd get more of the same. For Keir Starmer to, first of all, be brave enough to put himself forward for what is a awful job, even more terrible in circumstance the Labour Party was in, and then turn that around. You know, in June, we'll talk about where we are now, but in June, he reached the highest rating for an opposition leader, any opposition leader, since records began, since they started to record that in the early 70s. And now it's not too bad, by the way. There's been a boost for the government with the vaccine, of course.
You think 10 points off is not too bad?
But I feel, 26 points off when Keir Starmer was elected. And, you know, you can sum up where the Tories are now in one word, which is vaccine. So, no, he's had a tremendous first year, more than anyone could expect. And I think I caught a bit of Jack Straw earlier on, as Jack Straw was saying, we've had a long period of leaders who haven't been popular with the public and have been less popular than their Tory counterpart, going right back to Gordon.
Now, a few things to mention there. First of all, he says, you know, things are really bad when Labour loses Redcar. Now, Labour lost Redcar in 2010 when Alan Johnson was the Home Secretary. So a bit of an odd example to say this is the really important one. If you lose that, you know that this was the pits. Obviously, the 2019 election wasn't particularly good. No one's going to pretend it was. Anyway, a few other things he says. He says the Tory lead is all down to the vaccine. Now, this is the story that the Starmer stands like to say. He's doing brilliantly, but how could anyone possibly be popular when Boris Johnson is rolling out one of the most successful vaccination programs in the world? On one level, that's a reasonable argument. On another, it doesn't really fit with the facts. Because as we talked about on Friday, if you look at when Starmer's satisfaction really tanked, it was way before the vaccine was rolled out. So you can see here, Starmer, as Alan Johnson says there, people were very satisfied with him at the beginning of his leadership. I think partly because he looked like a prime minister. He's knighted. He wasn't Jeremy Corbyn, and the media were very nice to him. But once they sort of started to see the decisions he was making, that's when they changed their mind. So you can see there, the biggest drop is between October and December last year. That's when he goes from 15% net positivity to 5% net positivity. And the big drop there is among Labour voters. So he goes from 50% people saying he's doing a good job net to 31% saying that. And what happens then? It's not that the vaccine was rolled out, it's that he kicked Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party. He's basically said a big FU to a huge section of Labour's base. And guess who else is saying a huge FU to huge sections of Labour's base? Alan Johnson on LBC. If you want to be cheerleading for the Labour leader, which is fine, you know, he wants the Labour government, that's good. He's on LBC telling people Keir Starmer's a good guy. Then you have to take seriously the fact that one of the big things which is threatening Keir Starmer's ability to become prime minister is the fact that he's pissed off 1 in 5 Labour voters. 1 in 5 Labour voters thinks he's taking the party in the wrong direction, basically because he's been incredibly insulting to anyone who supported the previous leader. And now that is just being reinforced by Alan Johnson calling everyone a cult, right? So it seems like these people in a way have a death wish for the party. They would prefer to insult the left and kick out the left than have any chance of entering government by forming a broad coalition, which includes, yes, both voters in the Red Wall who voted Brexit. By the way, Alan Johnson ran the Labour Remain campaign, one of the worst campaigns we've seen in the last 20 years, right? He's one of the reasons we're in this mess. But you also have to have left-wing Labour voters. We saw in 2017, there's actually quite a lot of them. Ash, what do you make of people like Alan Johnson constantly coming out to basically say a big FU to the Labour left? What do they think they're achieving here?
Well, that's the thing, is that they actually don't want Keir Starmer to succeed at the helm of a kind of soft left, right-ish coalition. That's not what they want. What they want is for Starmer to not do so well in the local elections, to panic, for there to be some backbench jitters about losing confidence in the leader, and then what that creates the space for is a, Labour right coup within the shadow cabinet. So they're already making those noises of dissatisfaction about Annalisa Dodds. There have been talks about a lack of joined up thinking between himself and Angela Rayner, who was drafted in kind of to talk to the party's left. And I think that there are those like Alan Johnson who would look at it as a chance for return of some of those Labour right figures, in particular, the likes of Yvette Cooper. And what that shows us, it's two things, is that one, these people aren't serious about winning elections and winning over the public. They're simply not. What they want to do is reassert control over the party. And they don't care if it's in opposition for, 20 more years. And the second thing is that they also are completely out of ideas. Now, I don't want to define my politics by Jeremy Corbyn. I didn't even want to do that when he was leader. But it's certainly not a healthy political culture now that he's not leader. And, to the left's credit, while I think there are still, huge amounts of people who are quite rightfully very wounded by everything that's happened in the last few years, is that you do have those aspects of the left who are looking forward and thinking about what are the really important policies you need to get people moving on, what are the kind of movements that we need to draw together to make those things happen, whether that's around a Green New Deal or, a nurse's pay rise combined with rolling back on privatisation in the NHS. You do have people who are out there doing that thinking. Alan Johnson, I don't know what he would say if you go, okay, what's your solution to, the most pressing political, social and economic crises which face our country today? He would probably just say, I don't know, Yvette Cooper. I don't know, kick Jeremy Corbyn in the head one more time. These are people who are completely defined by and animated their own petty squabbles within a party that nobody, particularly cares for anymore. The country at large being a core component of that. And one of the reasons why people don't really care for it anymore is that people just see it as a vehicle for infighting. This is a mistake that the left makes, is that sometimes it gets so caught up in its own experience of the infighting, which is of course really awful, that it goes, oh, this is what people will be really interested in, is how we've been traduced and betrayed and vilified by the right. No, actually, people don't care about that. But it's also a mistake that the Labour right make, which is they go, aha, well, we heard that you don't like Jeremy Corbyn, and guess what? We still don't like him either, and we hate everybody that ever liked him. The public don't care about that. They don't care about your petty internal beefs. And so the more that you have this kind of story out there and just getting airtime, I think the more turned off people feel from politics. What we've learned is that there's a Conservative Party in power which is able to capitalise on that sense of apathy, cynicism, and lack of faith in politics' ability to do anything good for you or the community that you come from. The Conservatives are actually best placed to capitalise of that feeling. So no, I don't think it's going to be good for Labour. But the point of Alan Johnson doing these media rounds isn't for it to be good for Labour. It's for it to be good for the Labour right in terms of the progression of their own careers within the party. That's it. That's why it was so striking that he said, and I wrote this down in my hand to make a note of it, it's not because of the election result. Because I think even Alan Johnson recognises that in all those places, Redcar and Bolsover, that the Labour vote share was in decline and had been since 2001. It's about the result of 2019 offering a lifeline to a dying and discredited set of politics, because it allows them to define themselves against Corbyn rather than having to make a case to the country.
I'm going to say now, you should support Novara Media so we can get Ash a pad so she doesn't have to write the notes on her hand when we're showing videos live on Tysky Sour. Also, what I want you to do is hit the subscribe button. We go live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. and we put out videos every day. We have a little bit more of that interview. We're going to subject you to apologies in advance. It's Alan Johnson.
The criticism would be that for you Blairite lot, it's looking good because the hard left cult, as you've described them, have been pushed back. Jeremy Corbyn is no longer a Labour MP in Parliament. He's an independent. He has to sit as an independent now. But there are huge percentages of the membership, the Labour membership, who are much more left-wing, brought in by Jeremy Corbyn, and who, for instance, 66% of them want the Labour Party to campaign to return into the European Union. What does Starmer have to do to address that? Just ignore them?
No, well, I mean, in a sense, you're right, Tom, in that me endorsing Keir Starmer, same as Jack endorsing him, is kind of old Blairites kind of looking for a repeat of history. When I'm looking at, I can only look at it from my point of view. And the biggest poll, 7,000 people in the opinion poll in December. We've got to remember, we're not even 18 months beyond that general election, by the way, when, a huge boost for Conservatives. That opinion poll in December went into the figures, in a language that you and I will understand, that many listeners want, the C2DE votes, which is the working class, coming across to Labour, and Leave voters coming across to Labour. And so I think in terms of all the big issues, the big calls that Keir Starmer has had to make, he's made them right, not least of all on Europe. Remember, there was a lot of internal disagreement that we should oppose the deal on Europe, and Keir Starmer faced it down, and he was absolutely right to do it, because we can't go through those arguments over again, all over again. And for the 66% of Labour people who want us to go back into Europe, that's the 66% of Labour supporters who voted to remain. So they're not going to change their views, but the politics of this isn't that they're going to vote for another party to get Labour back into Europe.
Okay.
You're never supposed to say that. He said the quiet part out loud. The truth is they're never going to vote for anyone else, are they? Now, I actually, I agree with Keir Starmer and Alan Johnson's latest position on Europe, even if it's evolved over the past few years. I don't think Labour should be talking about going back into Europe. I actually didn't think they should have kicked up a fuss about Boris Johnson's deal. I think that's one of the things that Keir Starmer kind of has got right, even if it is a bit of a U-turn from his position when he was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. I mean, also an issue there was the question. It's not the Corbynites in the party who want to return to the European Union. That was not the contours of the battle over the past 3 years. I want to go to you though, Ash, on that really important thing, which I think is Alan Johnson there basically saying, look, I'm coming to this from a position whereby we only have to appeal to people in the red wall and people in the so-called red wall, which were traditional Labour seats, which went Conservative at the 2019 general election. Everyone else, no one else has anywhere to go, so we can completely ignore them. He's being quite explicit, isn't he?
Well, yeah, and he's also displaying the attitude which lost Labour the red wall and was responsible for their decline, at least in part, which is this idea of you've got this cohort of voters, they've got nowhere else to go, and somewhere else in the country there are swing voters, and they're the ones who you have to appeal to. Now, when Tony Blair was leader of the opposition, that thinking was centred around London and the cities. That there are swing constituencies here. We've got an opportunity to turn urban blue constituencies red, and so that's who we focus on. When it comes to the North and the Midlands and formerly industrial areas, well, they've got nowhere else to go. That wasn't true, and I think whether a myth or whether in truth there was a narrative which emerged of a patrician, distant and somewhat disdainful Labour leadership, which didn't care very much and took for granted all of those voters. And that's a narrative which the Conservative Party, having rebranded itself through the lens of Brexit, and indeed, parties further to the right of the Conservative Party, first UKIP and then the Brexit Party, were able to wield to their advantage. So simply shifting the lens and deciding, fuck, my camera's just conked out. I will try and get that working, but in the meantime, I'll keep talking. It's done that thing where it's overheated. By simply shifting the lens and deciding that what you're going to do is express your disdain and your disregard for another set of voters is just, I think, kicking that problem over to the other side of the football pitch. It's not actually dealing with it. What I would say is that there's also, I think, a fundamental lack of curiosity about what is it that the Conservative Party do so well, who are their voters, and how are they appealed to, because it's not simply through narrative about, disdain for patrician Labour. It's because, the Conservative Party have actually served some voters within those, formerly industrial heartlands very well. It's homeowners and it's pensioners and it's people who live in relative privilege in deprived areas, right? And that's who the Conservative Party are relentlessly focused on. And I think that there's a lack of honesty, both in terms of the Labour left, who want to homogenise these areas as just sort of, bastions of authentic working class decency. It's like they watched Brass Off once and they're like, that's everybody who lives in the north. And then there's also
great movie, to be fair,
a fantastic movie, but then there's, I think, there's a lack of willingness to explore the kind of other cohorts of voters which exist within the same place and who've been very cannily appealed to on a material basis by the Conservative Party. Both the left and I think the right struggle to deal with that. And also those on the left who say, well, that's fine, just focus on London will see you through. There's also a lack of honesty there about having to have a values-based container and a policy platform which can appeal to, there's quite diverse coalition. But Alan Johnson's not interested in having that conversation, and very few people are, because it would mean interrogating some of your core political assumptions about who the working class are, where they are, and how is it they live. And you don't want to ask those questions, because actually conjuring up a straw man of the working class in the most convenient shape to you is often a very good ventriloquist dummy for the thing that you always wanted to say anyway. It's very rarely got anything to do with how people live or what they actually think.
Michael Deary with £10 says, I think this is sarcastic. I feel so bad for Keir Starmer. The government has just presided over 150,000 deaths, chiefly because of their incompetence. What is there for Starmer to attack them on? It is, I know that's sucker, but it is quite a good point, actually, because they're saying, look, how could Keir Starmer have possibly done any better during this year? The government have been doing so well. They haven't. They've been doing terribly. It's the same as the situation. Everyone's like, any other leader would be 20 points ahead. Yeah, that was because the reason they said that was because it was quite chaotic the way the Tories were handling Brexit. I mean, letting 150,000 people die, that's a lot worse than kind of cocking up the Brexit process. Right, so I do think you're letting Keir Starmer off quite lightly if you say, oh no, how could he have possibly expected to get ahead of the Conservatives? The vaccine is out now. Yes, obviously the vaccine was going to give a boost to the Conservatives, but he started from level pegging even when we'd gone into a catastrophic late lockdown, which was tragically leading to lots of deaths. Ash, yes, can
I chime in very quickly? I know I'm not supposed to do this because this is your show, Michael, but I'm going to plug my own, because tomorrow evening on Downstream, I've got Samuel Earle coming on to discuss just why the Conservative Party are so good at what they do in terms of winning elections and maintaining that polling lead. Obviously exploring it with relation to coronavirus, and is there or is there not a vaccine bounce? How is it they've managed to evade accountability for that absolutely dreadful number of deaths? But we'll be going into it in quite some depth. So viewers are interested, tune in.
So long as it's Novara content, you're always allowed to promote it on the show. Sorry, I interrupted the important bit though. Tune in tomorrow at
5 p.m. on this here YouTube channel, the one you're on right now.
Fabulous. That's a good reason to hit subscribe, isn't it? Do make sure you hit that subscribe button. Ash, it has been a pleasure speaking to you this evening. I do hope that when the pub gardens open, I'm still going to be lucky enough to spend my Monday evenings with you. And thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight and your comments on Twitter. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.